I still remember the sound. Not a shout, not a slam. Just a quiet click that split my life in two. It was the click of his keys at the door, the sound that always meant home. But that night, the keys were heavy in his hand. And somehow, even before he spoke, I knew they carried more than metal. They carried a decision. He didn't set them down like he always did. He walked straight past me, his eyes empty, his silence sharp. He didn't look angry or guilty, just finished. And that quiet click became the sound of everything breaking, the sound that told me my life, as I knew it was over. People like to say they saw it coming. They didn't. I didn't. Love has a way of blinding you with routine. The small gestures that trick you into feeling safe. The coffee he'd make in the mornings. The inside jokes we built over years. The way he'd hold my hand during a bad day. Those things anchored me. I clung to them, even as they began to change. Then came the late-night texts he wouldn't explain. The sudden work trips that didn't add up. The evenings where his body was home, but his mind was miles away. I noticed. Of course I did. But I explained everything away. I told myself he was tired, stressed, distracted. I forgave before he even asked. I stayed because that's what people in love do. They stay. That night, he left with one suitcase, and a smile so casual it almost looked practiced. He said he needed a better life, as if life was something you could upgrade like a phone. His words were smooth, almost kind, but they hit harder than any argument could. I knew what he meant by a better life. He meant her. The rich girl, the one I'd heard about in whispers and seen in his glances. She was everything I wasn't. Glossy, effortless, adored. She had money that opened doors. A house that smelled like new beginnings. And a laugh that seemed to echo in rooms I couldn't afford to enter. I stood there, frozen, as he turned and left. The sound of the door closing was soft, but it landed like thunder in my chest. Then came the silence. Thick, unnatural, almost alive. I looked around the apartment, at the little world we had built together, and suddenly everything felt like evidence of a crime. The chipped mugs we both loved, the mismatched sheets we joked about replacing, the old lamp that cast a soft light in the corner. They all looked like witnesses. Witnesses to a story that ended without warning. Shock doesn't come as tears right away. It comes as stillness. I just stood there, breathing too carefully, as if any sudden movement would make it real. And when it finally sank in, when the weight of his absence started pressing down, I felt myself break in quiet, invisible ways. The first thing I did was make a list, not out of logic, but survival. Call work, lock accounts, move important things. I told myself I needed to stay practical. That emotion could wait. But as I checked the list, as I moved through the apartment collecting fragments of our life, something began to grow inside me. Something sharper than pain. It was clarity. He had chosen, and now I had to choose too. I wish I could say I handled it gracefully. I didn't. I cried until my voice cracked. I screamed into pillows until I couldn't feel my throat. I scrolled through his social media, like someone looking for proof that it was all a misunderstanding. But what I found wasn't the truth. It was a show. Pictures of him smiling in places we once talked about, visiting together, standing beside her like she was the prize at the end of a cruel game. Perfect lighting, perfect captions, perfect lies. It wasn't just betrayal. It was public humiliation. People could see it. Like, comment, move on. While I was left behind with the silence that never scrolled away. That's when I realized something important. People like him, the ones who leave you for something shinier, always assume you'll crumble. They think the story ends when they walk away. They believe you'll break quietly, fade out of their lives like an old photograph. But they forget that the person left behind still has choices. And sometimes, the most dangerous person is the one who has lost everything, because they have nothing left to lose. and everything left to learn. I didn't start with revenge. I started with awareness. I started watching him, not obsessively, but strategically. I studied the way he moved through his new life, the parties, the deals, the people he surrounded himself with. He looked happy, but it was the kind of happiness that depended on approval. He had traded love for luxury, and you could see it in his eyes. The subtle caution, the fear that if he stopped performing, the applause would fade. He thought he had won. He didn't realize he had only changed cages. In the quiet of those nights, when the city hummed outside my window, and the air still smelled faintly like him, I made myself a promise. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. It was a vow I carved into my mind. I will take back everything he thought he stole. My dignity, my confidence, my future. I will rebuild what he tried to destroy, but bigger, stronger, untouchable. Revenge didn't look like in the movies. There were no dramatic confrontations or fiery speeches. It looked like focus, like reading, learning, paying attention. I started studying the world he left me for. The language of money, the hierarchy of influence, the way people like her lived and moved. I learned not to envy it, but to understand it. If he thought money could protect him, I would learn how money really works. If he thought charm was enough, I would learn how truth can cut through the illusion. Slowly, the pain turned into something else, precision. The tears stopped coming, and plans began forming instead. I realized I didn't have to destroy him to win. All I had to do was build something so powerful, so undeniable, that his loss would echo louder than my heartbreak ever did. That night ended with me sitting by the window, looking out at the city lights, the same city where he was starting his new life. I wasn't crying anymore. I was thinking, planning, rebuilding, because sometimes focus is more dangerous than fury. Fury burns out fast. Focus builds empires. And that was the night I decided to stop being the woman he left behind and start becoming the woman he'd never see coming. When he left, it felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under me, and I was free falling through everything I thought was solid. For years, our life had been simple, predictable, and that's exactly what made it beautiful. I used to believe in the rhythm of small joys. The smell of coffee in the morning, the way he'd hum out of tune when washing dishes, the way our cat would sleep between us like a furry wall of peace. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. We had plans. A small house that always needed fixing, a car that squeaked but ran, a dream of saving enough for a quiet vacation someday. That was the life I knew. It was steady, safe, until he decided it wasn't enough. When he walked away, everything collapsed in silence. The world around me didn't stop, but mine did. People kept living, working, laughing, posting perfect pictures, while I stood there wondering how something so ordinary could suddenly become unbearable. Everyone had advice, the kind that sounds comforting until you realize it's empty. You'll get through it. Time heals. Maybe this was for the best. Easy words for people who hadn't watched their trust be used as a stepping stone. I didn't want comfort. I wanted direction. So I built one, a map. Not for moving on, but for rebuilding. I started by listing what I still had. My name, still mine. My skills untouched. My savings, small, but real. And most importantly, a stubbornness that refused to let him be the story's ending. Then, I wrote down what was gone. His presence, our plans, the future I thought we shared. Seeing it in writing changed something. Pain became data. I could work with data. I could measure it, dissect it, transform it. I threw myself into work. Not the way people drown their pain in distractions, but with purpose. I worked longer hours, took on tougher clients, and learned to hold my ground. At first it was survival, but slowly it became empowerment. Every time I succeeded at something new, it rewired my mind. proving I didn't need him to validate my worth. I took risks, big ones. I started saying no to things that drained me, and yes to things that scared me. Growth is uncomfortable, but so is staying broken. While I rebuilt myself, I also watched him from afar. Not obsessively, but strategically. His new life looked like a glossy magazine spread. Designer clothes, luxury dinners, charity events with flashbulbs and fake laughter. He had traded sincerity for spectacle. The rich girl he left me for fit perfectly in that world. She wasn't necessarily cruel, just polished, confident, untouched by the kind of struggle that had built me. Together, they were an image, not a connection. A brand, not a bond. I saw their smiles online. Curated, filtered, flawless. And yet, behind that perfection, I sensed fragility. People like him, people who live for image, they crumble the moment the applause stops. That realization was fuel. I knew then that my revenge wouldn't come from shouting the truth. It would come from building something so strong, so unshakable, that his choices would echo back to him like a warning. I started learning the language of power, business, contracts, influence. I studied how decisions are made behind closed doors. I learned how to read people, how to negotiate without emotion, how to walk into a room and command respect. Every new skill was a weapon sharpened in silence. I began to understand reputation, not as vanity, but as strategy. People like him build their identity on perception, not reality. So I collected facts, small, verifiable truths, dates, transactions, public statements. I didn't fabricate. I documented. I built a quiet archive, not for blackmail, but for protection. And perhaps future opportunity. Truth is a slow weapon, but when it lands, it leaves marks that can't be erased. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my circle. I cut off anyone who fed on gossip or pity. I surrounded myself with people who pushed me forward, who challenged me to grow, who clapped for progress instead of pain. I learned to protect my peace. When someone said, "Just move on," I said, "I am, but I'm doing it my way." Healing, I realized, isn't passive. It's work. Hard, deliberate, painful work. Money became part of the plan too, but not in the way he valued it. For him, money was status. For me, it became freedom. I learned how to grow it, how to manage it, how to make it speak quietly but powerfully. Each contract signed, each payment received, was a step toward independence. I wasn't chasing luxury. I was chasing control. The kind of control that means never having to depend on someone who can leave without looking back. Sometimes the anger flared, raw and loud. There were nights I wanted to expose him, to tear down his facade with one public truth. But then I'd remind myself, noise fades, precision doesn't. Real revenge isn't chaos. It's calculated. It's when your silence becomes heavier than their presence. I learned to hold my emotions like a blade, not to wave them wildly, but to use them with purpose. Every choice I made, every goal I set, was part of a long game. By the time months had passed, I could see the difference. He was still performing for attention. I was performing for results. He was still chasing validation. I was building foundation. My world had changed. Not overnight, but deliberately, layer by layer. I was no longer the woman he left behind. I was someone else entirely. Someone who could stand in any room, look him in the eye, and not flinch. And deep down, I knew. The real revenge wasn't going to be about what I'd take from him. It would be about what I'd become without him. Because someday, he'd look at me and realize the life he left behind had turned into the life he could never reach again. That thought alone steadied me. It wasn't about payback anymore. It was about power. Quiet, earned, undeniable power. Betrayal never arrives with thunder. It drips in quietly, almost politely, through cracks you didn't notice forming. It hides inside small acts that seem harmless on their own. A missed call, a short reply, a forgotten date. I used to brush those moments away with excuses that made him sound noble. He's busy. He's stressed. He just needs space. That's how betrayal grows. In the soft soil of understanding. I kept forgiving, thinking love was the same as endurance. But love built on one-sided patience eventually turns into blindness. And I had been blind for far too long. The shift came in whispers, not in explosions. He became vague when he spoke about work, detached when I talked about plans. His laughter turned hollow, his gaze distracted. The man who once texted me at lunch, just because, began disappearing for days, returning with stories that didn't fit together. At first, I didn't want to investigate. The truth felt heavier than ignorance. But there comes a point when pain becomes practical. When you'd rather face the truth than be haunted by questions. So, I began watching, quietly. I noticed patterns. He said he was traveling for business, yet his phone location told a different story. He claimed to be at meetings but posted photos from expensive restaurants. His messages became short and rehearsed, like lines from a script he didn't write himself. The first time I realized something was off, I took a screenshot, then another, not because I planned revenge, not yet, but because I knew one day he'd twist the story, and I wanted to remember what really happened. Betrayal makes you an archivist of pain. I kept files, dates, receipts, not of love, but of lies. Social media became his stage. Every post of his new life felt like a slap wrapped in luxury. There he was, sipping wine beside people who smiled like advertisements. His captions spoke about success, growth, and finding happiness after struggle. The irony was unbearable. I was the struggle he'd repackaged as life experience. The comments below those posts were the worst part. Strangers congratulating him for his journey, people envying the shine without seeing the rot beneath it. That's when I realized image was his new currency. He wasn't just living differently. He was performing. The performance cracked the day he gave that interview. I hadn't planned to listen, but curiosity pulled me in. He spoke about sacrifice, about letting go of people who limit your potential. I remember the tone of his voice, smooth and confident, as if betrayal was a virtue. My chest went cold. He was rewriting our story into something motivational. According to him, leaving me wasn't cruelty. It was courage. That single word, sacrifice, burned itself into me. It became my catalyst. He wanted to look brave. I would show him what bravery really looked like. So I studied him, not as a lover anymore, but as a subject. I began mapping the world he now inhabited. The rich girl, the investors, the circles filled with people who cared more about champagne than character. It didn't take long to see the fractures. Beneath the polished photos were shaky deals, unpaid invoices, and partnerships held together by ego. He had always been charming, but charm fades fast when money and attention become the only glue. I didn't need to invent anything. The cracks were already there. I only needed to collect the truth. Meanwhile, I kept my distance and built my own structure. My job became more than a paycheck. It became my independence. I took risks I used to avoid. I reached out to clients he once mocked as too small and turned them into long-term opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he was climbing ladders built on illusion, I was laying bricks. Slowly, steadily, I was building something real. Every project completed, every bill paid in my name alone, felt like a quiet act of defiance. I no longer needed to shout that I was fine. My progress spoke louder than any post. Still, the conflict didn't live entirely outside of me. There were nights when guilt would sneak in, whispering that I was becoming bitter, that maybe I should just let go. But I wasn't planning to destroy him. I was planning to reveal him. There's a difference. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was setting the record straight. He had rewritten our story to make himself the hero. I was collecting evidence to make sure history remembered accurately. Sometimes justice looks like patience disguised as silence. The first real opportunity came disguised as a footnote. A contract dispute he thought was buried. A friend mentioned it casually, and I felt the universe pause. It was small, a forgotten deal from a side project, but it had gaps big enough to drive consequence through. I got a copy, read every line, and realized he had made a rookie mistake. Promises with no legal safety net, exaggerated claims tied to his name. Nothing illegal, but embarrassing if exposed. It wasn't a weapon, it was leverage. And leverage, used correctly, changes everything. I didn't act impulsively. Timing mattered. Instead, I reached out to people in his circle. Not as an enemy, but as someone curious and professional. I attended the same events, spoke to the same contacts, asked quiet questions. It was strange how easily doors opened when you didn't announce your intentions. Most of his allies were polite, but detached. They liked his image, not his integrity. They smiled at him but gossiped behind his back. It confirmed what I already knew. His empire was built on applause, not respect. With every piece of evidence, my anger cooled. What replaced it was focus. I stopped thinking like someone wronged and started thinking like someone reclaiming power. Every fact I gathered, every lie I uncovered, was a brick in the truth I was constructing. I didn't need to ruin him. I only needed to let his world reveal itself. Power built on deception collapses when the lights turn on. All I had to do was flip the switch, so I kept collecting, waiting, preparing. I became quiet, calm, deliberate. I didn't raise my voice or make accusations. I simply watched as his false stories began to unravel under their own contradictions. That's the thing about conflict. Sometimes the most powerful move is restraint. Let them burn their own stage while you stand in the audience watching. And when the smoke clears, you don't need to say a word. The truth will already be speaking for you. There's a strange kind of calm that comes after heartbreak. It isn't peace, it's precision. Once the grief burned out, what was left inside me wasn't rage, but clarity. I stopped replaying the moments of betrayal and started studying them. People like him depend on chaos. They move quickly, spin stories faster than anyone can check them. The only way to disarm them is to slow everything down. So I did. I became deliberate. Every message, every public post, every quote he gave, I archived. I didn't do it out of obsession. I did it because truth, once gathered, becomes leverage. He had taken my kindness for blindness. He was about to learn the difference. At first, it was small things. The details in his social media captions, the names he tagged, the way he referred to projects that weren't entirely his. I noticed how carefully he curated his image, how he recycled other people's words, other people's labor, polishing them until they looked like his own brilliance. He didn't realize that the internet never forgets. I began building a private folder. Screenshots, timestamps, side-by-side comparisons. It wasn't about exposure yet. It was about readiness. When you've been betrayed, patience becomes a kind of weapon. People around me started to notice the shift. I no longer spoke about him with anger. That scared him more than fury ever could. Silence is unnerving to people who thrive on performance. He reached out once, a polite message pretending concern, asking if we could talk things through. For closure. Closure was his word for control. I didn't reply. You don't give explanations to someone who edited you out of your own story. You wait, you watch, and you let the truth accumulate. I began reaching out quietly to people he had wronged. Not allies, just witnesses. One had been cut out of a deal he'd promised to share. Another had seen her writing appear under his name. We compared notes. The patterns were identical. Charm, exploitation, discard. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. The truth wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone he'd used. We didn't plot or threaten. We collected evidence, emails, contracts, timelines. Facts have a language of their own, and once you speak it fluently, lies lose their power. Meanwhile, he kept building his facade. His posts grew grander, his quotes more self-righteous. He started calling himself a mentor, a visionary, a man who believed in uplifting others. I almost admired the audacity, but every performance leaves fingerprints. He slipped once, in an interview, mentioning a project that I knew had never legally been his. That clip became part of my growing record. I didn't spread it, not yet. The best way to expose a liar is to let them talk long enough to contradict themselves. Then came the opportunity. A feature story about him was being prepared for an online magazine. A profile meant to celebrate his rise. I knew the journalist. We had crossed paths during a project months earlier. I didn't pitch anything. I simply sent a short, polite message. You might want to verify a few of his claims, especially about his design collaborations. Attached were files, dated drafts, and links. Nothing dramatic, just quiet evidence. Journalists respect documentation. She thanked me. No promises, just professionalism. That was all I needed. Weeks later, the article dropped. It wasn't an expose. It was subtler, more dangerous. It fact-checked. It noted discrepancies, missing credits, inconsistencies between his words and the paperwork. The tone was neutral, but the impact wasn't. People started asking questions. Comments appeared beneath his posts. Wait, didn't someone else work on that? Weren't these designs part of another project? Small ripples, but they grew. His silence stretched too long, and silence, for someone who loved the spotlight, became suspicious. He tried to recover, of course. He posted about being misunderstood, about how people twist things when they can't match your success. It might have worked if the evidence hadn't already started circulating privately among professionals. Screenshots, contracts, side-by-side comparisons. They found their way into group chats, DMs, and creative circles. The truth was moving without my help now. Once truth starts walking on its own, you don't have to push it anymore. I watched it unfold with an odd sense of detachment. There was no thrill, no triumph, just inevitability. He wasn't destroyed, not yet, but his mask had cracked, and once cracks appear, the rest is gravity. The same people who once defended him began to hesitate before using his name. The admiration turned into polite distance. His invitations slowed. His posts grew defensive. His tone less certain. He had spent years constructing a mirror to reflect admiration. And now the reflection stared back empty. I kept my distance, but I stayed alert. I didn't gloat or comment publicly. That's the mistake people make. They announce victory too early. My satisfaction came in quieter forms. A corrected credit on a published piece. A new client who reached out saying they admired my resilience. A small message from another freelancer thanking me for speaking up. These were small things, but they added up to something solid. Reputation built on truth, not illusion. I learned that exposure isn't about shouting louder. It's about standing still, long enough for deception to reveal itself. He had underestimated stillness. He had mistaken silence for defeat. But silence, when paired with evidence, is thunder waiting for the right echo. He had once told me that power belonged to those who control the story. He wasn't wrong, but he forgot one thing. Stories outlive storytellers. And once the truth enters the narrative, it rewrites everything. And so I watched, not with vengeance but with certainty, as the image he'd spent so long perfecting began to unravel, thread by thread, all by his own hand. My plan wasn't a movie scene with dramatic music and revenge montages. It was quiet, surgical, and boring in all the ways that matter. The kind of work that wins because it doesn't burn bridges. It simply closes doors that were never meant to be open. After the betrayal, I understood two things clearly. Charm can disguise theft, and sloppy people always leave a paper trail if you know where to look. So I began the work of turning what I'd learned into leverage. The first step was collection. I already had fragments, drafts saved on my hard drive, late-night messages, rough versions with my notes in the margins. I stopped treating those things like private wounds and started treating them like evidence. Screenshots, timestamps, versions, receipts, email threads. Everything was copied, labeled, and backed up. I made folders with names that didn't feel dramatic. Design V1, email, chain launch, invoice, records. The naming felt ridiculous until it became power. Having the facts organized meant I could move without emotion and present without pleading. I built a dossier, not to send wild accusations into the void, but to create something that could stand if anyone asked for proof. I asked a friend in accounting to glance over invoices and flag anything odd. Another friend in law looked at contracts to point out ambiguous clauses and potential leverage. They weren't there for drama. They were there because sloppy promises look the same, whether you're at dinner or at a board meeting. When you're dealing with people who rely on perception over preparation, a little paperwork is devastating. Restoring credit and contracts became step 2. Where our work had been appropriated, I reached out to platforms and partners with calm professional messages. I attached the evidence, highlighted the discrepancies, and asked for correction. Some platforms responded quietly. They didn't want the noise either. They fix misattribution because their integrity matters more than one influencer's image. It was satisfying to see a byline change or an image caption updated, but those small fixes weren't the end game. They were the first dominoes. Step 3 was about alignment. I didn't want a mob. I wanted a coalition of people who cared about fairness. Freelancers who had been erased, vendors who hadn't been paid, small partners whose roles had been overstated. We didn't meet in angry groups. We shared documents in private threads and compared notes. Most of these people appreciated the restraint. They wanted redress, not spectacle. When multiple voices with documentation speak together, institutions listen. Reputation economies are built on trust. When trust smells like risk, investors and collaborators pull back. I learned to use the right channels. Social media rants make for catharsis, not consequence. Public accusations without documentation are easy to dismiss. So I used formal notices where they mattered. Polite legal letters requesting correction, platform dispute forms filled with dates and attachments, and careful emails to mutual professional contacts that simply said, "Fact check attached." The messages were neutral in tone, clinical in intent. That neutrality removed the emotional hook he could exploit. When you speak with documents, there is less room for spin. Throughout this, I kept personal safety and boundaries prioritized. This was business, not wartime. I refused to humiliate. There's a difference between ruthless in protecting your rights and cruel for satisfaction. I never leaked private messages to shame him. I never invented claims for the sake of spectacle. That discipline protected me legally and morally. It also made my case harder to dismiss. People who live by image are adept at turning personal attacks into sympathy plays. I refused to give him that narrative. There were nights of doubt. Friends advised letting it go. Others said the fight would take too much. I listened, considered, and then returned to the dossier. Letting it go would have been a choice to accept that my labor and loyalty could be repackaged as someone else's trophy. That felt like permission for them to do the same to others. I decided I would not be the example that made exploitation comfortable. Execution happened quietly and in small waves. First corrections. Platforms updated credits. A misattributed image was pulled down. Invoices got reissued. Then a bigger move. A partner he had been courting asked for documentation after a casual question from their legal team. They paused the deal. That pause mattered. For people who bet on momentum, a pause forces a re-evaluation. Suddenly, what had looked like inevitable success looked risky. People who profit from shine are conservative when risk increases. That conservatism is leverage. What I loved about the plan was how it used his own tactics against him. He had relied on perception, quick posts, confident quotes, a circle that amplified him. Perception bends under evidence. Where he had charm, I had records. Where he had a smile and a story, I had contracts and timestamps. Charm works when no one checks. Process works when they do. I kept living publicly, but differently. I continued to do the work that mattered to me, to take on projects that sharpened my skills and reputation. That steadiness was part of the strategy. If I reacted only, I would be predictable. By getting results, I created contrast. The market prefers reliability over theatrics when money and time are at stake. My quiet wins looked small day to day, but looked decisive when compared to someone perpetually on the defensive. As the plan progressed, a strange calm settled over me. Action replaced raw emotion. Strategy replaced spite. The emotional spikes dulled, because the process required patience more than passion. Watching the dominoes tilt wasn't vindictive. It felt like stewardship. I had set things in motion that protected, not just me, but others, who might have been taken for granted. The best revenge often isn't the loudest. It's the one that leaves you with a better life. I followed a simple rule. Never lie. Never embellish. The minute you let fiction into your defense, the story turns into he said, she said, and everything becomes murky. Facts are boring but final. They don't need drama. They just need clarity and consistency. That discipline made every claim defensible and every action ethical. Finally, the hardest part was waiting. I set the dominoes and prepared to watch. Watching can feel cruel, but when you are watching truth do its work, it's more like stewardship than spectacle. The tilt came in quiet ways. Calls unanswered. A project paused. A partner withdrawing. Small corrections that accumulated into consequence. It wasn't instantaneous. It was inevitable. And in that inevitability, there was something satisfying that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with justice. Execution is the quiet part people forget when they fantasize about revenge. It's not the cinematic explosion people imagine. No dramatic confrontations. No shouting in rain-soaked streets. It's quiet, almost boring, but it's also the most dangerous part because it's precise. This was the point where discipline mattered more than emotion. I had my dossier ready, organized and airtight, my allies aware and waiting, and my channels mapped out like a chessboard. Now came the moment when theory had to meet reality. When the facts I had gathered had to walk into rooms where truth still meant something, and see if they could stand on their own. The first step was the formal notice. A clean, professional document drafted by a friend who worked in law. It didn't scream, it didn't threaten. It simply laid out what had been taken, what was owed, and what the timeline for correction would be. It was signed and sent with courtesy, and that's what made it powerful. Professionalism disarms people who thrive on chaos. He had built a reputation on smooth talk, quick fixes, and emotional manipulation. But paper doesn't react to charm. A legal document doesn't care about apologies. It demands accountability. And when that notice landed in his inbox, I knew it hit harder than any confrontation ever could. It forced him to acknowledge what he had done, not through feelings, but through the cold logic of consequence. His initial reaction was predictable. The soft deflection of someone cornered, but still trying to play nice. Messages poured in, apologies, promises to make things right, requests for time. But those messages weren't for me. They were performances for his own self-image. What he didn't realize was that the machinery was already moving. My quiet inquiries to partners and collaborators had begun weeks before. My allies were not loud, but they were steady. People who asked questions in the right rooms. People who mattered in the spaces where reputation was currency. The questions they raised weren't dramatic. They were professional. Could we review the paperwork? Do we have confirmation of authorship? Was that payment processed correctly? Those questions built friction, and friction slows momentum. The first real fracture appeared when one of his key partners paused a collaboration. The contract review surfaced inconsistencies, unsigned amendments, vague attributions, small but crucial errors that could no longer be ignored. From the outside, it seemed minor, but in industries built on momentum and perception, a pause is lethal. Pauses invite scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to discovery. And discovery, for someone built on illusion, is exposure. That one hesitation rippled outward. Another partner quietly postponed a launch. A vendor asked for updated payment details. A client requested confirmation of deliverables. Like a house built on a shifting foundation, small cracks began to widen into something impossible to patch. Meanwhile, I turned to the platforms, the digital ecosystems, where so much of our shared work had been misrepresented. I filed formal claims, attaching screenshots, email trails, and date-stamped versions of files. Platforms respect documentation, not emotion, and because I had built my dossier methodically, responses came quickly. Credits were corrected. Misused images were removed. Posts that once presented my work as his vanished quietly, replaced by silence. There was no announcement, no spectacle, just the quiet rewriting of truth in the records that mattered. The internet forgets slowly, but it does correct when you present evidence it can't ignore. As these small administrative victories accumulated, the energy shifted. The story, his version of it, began to dissolve. Behind the scenes, people whispered not about scandal, but about reliability. He's talented, but something seems off, they said. That off is all it takes. Doubt, once seeded, grows fast in the soil of reputation. And because I stayed silent publicly, he couldn't frame it as an attack. My silence was strategy. I wasn't arguing. I was letting facts speak. He tried to recover with charm, of course. He always did. At events, he smiled wider, spoke louder, tried to project control. But I could see the strain. The smile that once commanded rooms now looked brittle. And, at one particular event, a networking function filled with the very people he had once impressed, the shift was visible. Conversations dimmed when he entered. Questions turned formal. Laughter softened into politeness. In spaces that once celebrated him, there was now caution. He sensed it too. Reputation doesn't crumble all at once. It erodes quietly, like paint peeling under pressure. Financially, the cracks deepened. Paused contracts became cancelled ones. Vendors demanded clarity before shipping new products. Clients deferred renewals. None of this was dramatic, but each was a brick removed from the structure he had built. Momentum faltered, and when momentum goes, so does confidence. He began reaching out more, offering partial payments, half-hearted gestures of repair. But once people start asking questions, it's too late to rebuild the illusion. All the while, I kept my focus on growth. New projects, better clients, quiet wins that built credibility without noise. I didn't talk about what was happening behind the scenes. I didn't post vague quotes or cryptic lines about karma. I let my work do the talking, and that was the real contrast. While his energy scattered trying to contain fallout, mine consolidated into progress. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was leading my own trajectory. Then came the unexpected validation. A public correction from someone once deep in his circle. A collaborator who had unknowingly credited him for my work posted an update, naming me directly and acknowledging the oversight. That post hit harder than any confrontation ever could. It was objective, factual, and public. No drama, no accusation, just truth restored. The comments under that post were polite but telling. People noticed. They always do. By the time the dust began to settle, the transformation was complete. I hadn't shouted, exposed, or humiliated. I had simply executed, step by step, file by file, truth by truth. That's the thing people miss about revenge. The power isn't in the explosion. It's in the structure. Execution is about turning paperwork into pressure, precision into power. It's not about watching someone fall. It's about watching the world quietly correct itself. And realizing that, for once, you don't have to do anything, but stand still and let consequence finish the work you started. Climax isn't always about explosion or spectacle. Sometimes it's about quiet disintegration. It's the sound of something coming undone, thread by thread, without a single scream to mark the moment. That's how his world began to unravel. It started not with an argument or a dramatic revelation, but with silence. The kind of silence that creeps in when people stop replying to calls, when meetings get postponed indefinitely, and when invitations once taken for granted simply never arrive. The infrastructure of his influence, built on charm and manipulation, began to crack. Not because I shouted, but because truth had finally started whispering in the right ears. The first tremor came through a friend in the industry who mentioned, almost casually, that one of his sponsors had reassessed their commitments. It sounded polite, harmless even, but I knew what that meant. Sponsors don't pull funding unless there's concern. Usually quiet, behind closed doors, informed by lawyers and accountants who have found inconsistencies too large to ignore. And soon enough, the pattern repeated. One sponsor became two. One rescinded invitation became several. And what used to be effortless access started turning into polite distance. The world he had relied on, that shiny curated stage of endless validation, was shrinking. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post cryptic quotes about karma or justice. That wasn't the purpose. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about watching accountability take its natural course. Actions have gravity. When you manipulate long enough, eventually the weight of deceit pulls everything down. What was fascinating wasn't his collapse, but how quiet it was. There were no explosions, just a slow withdrawal of trust. People who once clung to his confidence began to step away, gently, as though leaving a room that had grown uncomfortable. Months later, fate handed me a moment I hadn't asked for. Or perhaps the universe just has a sense of timing. It was at a small industry event, one of those casual mixes filled with laughter, low music, and people trading stories. I hadn't expected him to be there, but he was, polished as ever, wearing that trademark smile, still performing the role of the charming success story. And then he saw me. For a brief second, his composure faltered. It wasn't dramatic, just a flicker. The kind of hesitation you see when someone realizes the script they'd prepared no longer fits the scene they've walked into. His eyes darted toward the exits, then toward familiar faces, as if searching for a cue, for someone to tell him how to handle this new reality. When he finally walked over, it was with forced confidence. He tried the same old rhythm, light banter, soft apology, that slightly tilted smile meant to disarm. "I've been meaning to reach out," he said, as though time could erase consequence. His words were smooth, but his tone was brittle. He talked about learning, about change, about how he wanted to make things right. I let him talk, not out of sympathy, but out of patience. And when he finished, I told him clearly, calmly, and without bitterness what I wanted. Public correction where credit had been stolen, fair compensation for the work he'd taken, and transparent dealings moving forward. He flinched, not visibly enough for others to notice, but I saw it. He tried to bargain, as though truth were negotiable. Offers that were less than fair. Promises without proof. He still believed he could charm his way out of consequence. But the difference now was that I wasn't seeking validation. I was seeking closure. And closure doesn't need compromise. I told him no. Plainly, firmly. He nodded, eyes flicking away, as though searching for an audience that wasn't there. Not long after that encounter, the next major collapse hit. A highly anticipated collaboration, something he had teased for months, was suddenly postponed indefinitely. The public announcement was sterile, almost bureaucratic, due diligence concerns. But those two words spoke volumes. They meant someone had checked the paperwork, followed the trail, and found what I already knew. Behind the scenes, it wasn't anger that spread through his circle. It was caution. People in his network began reviewing their own records, their own dealings with him. In a world where perception is everything, that kind of review is lethal. The ripples spread further than I had expected. A few of his friends, once his loudest defenders, reached out to me privately. Not to apologize, but to understand. Their messages were hesitant, respectful. They wanted to know the truth. They wanted to see the documents. When I showed them, their replies were quiet. I didn't know, one said. Another simply wrote, "That makes sense now." These weren't allies won. They were illusions lost. The unraveling had reached not just his career, but his credibility. The true climax arrived not with confrontation, but with correction. A respected figure in our field, someone whose endorsement had once elevated him, issued a statement. It was brief, formal, almost cold. An earlier attribution has been reviewed. Proper credit has now been assigned. We regret the oversight. That correction landed like a thunderclap in silence. There was no public argument, no spectacle, just an adjustment in the record. But in industries built on image, that's enough to fracture everything. People noticed. People always notice when credibility shifts hands. He wasn't destroyed, not in the way movies depict it. There were no tears or scenes. He simply faded. The collaboration stopped. The calls slowed. The applause turned into polite acknowledgement. That's the real face of downfall. It's not explosion, it's evaporation. One day, you're the center of attention. The next, you're standing in a room full of people who used to cheer for you, wondering why no one looks your way anymore. As for me, I didn't feel triumphant, just steady. The relief was quiet but profound. The record was corrected. The people who had been hurt were seen. The truth had weight again. That was enough, because revenge, at its core, isn't about destruction, it's about restoration. It's the moment when falsehoods finally collapse under the weight of what's real. And as his world folded inward, mine began to expand. I was no longer fighting for recognition. I already had it. The silence that once haunted me had turned into peace. The applause he lost wasn't mine to take. It was simply gone. And in that emptiness, the truth finally had room to breathe. Fallout is never clean, even when it's deserved. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It lingers like smoke, curling around everything it touches. Reputation, emotion, time. For him, it started as inconvenience, but slowly grew into erosion. The contracts that had once seemed certain began to vanish one by one. Calls went unanswered. Collaborations dissolved in silence. And vendors who once smiled through delays started demanding full payment, backed by documentation. He was no longer the man everyone wanted to be near. He was the man people approached cautiously, calculating risk before reputation. He tried to rebuild, of course. Men like him always do. They mistake resilience for reinvention. He hosted smaller events, reached out to old contacts with polite humility, promised he had changed. But rebuilding requires more than a new facade. It requires trust. And trust, once broken, is not something you can purchase with charm or polish. It must be earned, inch by inch, through consistency and accountability. And he wasn't ready for that kind of work yet. His losses weren't public scandals. They were quiet exclusions. Projects that moved forward without him. Invitations that never arrived. People who once tagged him in every success stopped mentioning him altogether. Silence became his mirror. He was no longer being talked about. And in industries built on attention, being unseen is the sharpest punishment. But fallout didn't spare me either. Standing up always comes with its own cost. And mine came in waves. I received messages of every kind. Some angry, calling me vindictive. Others grateful, thanking me for exposing truth. Some accused me of ruining his future. Others admitted they had seen what I had described, but hadn't known how to confront it. I had expected all of it. The backlash, the whispers, the uncomfortable half-support from those too afraid to pick a side. When you correct the record, you disrupt comfort, and people protect comfort more fiercely than they protect truth. The practical costs were heavy too. Legal consultations, documentation, and emotional energy drained me more than I expected. Nights of lost sleep, days of second-guessing myself, wondering whether I'd gone too far or not far enough. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself, this wasn't destruction, it was accountability. Justice doesn't always look noble. Sometimes it looks like paperwork and exhaustion. Still, even in that fatigue, there were unexpected gifts. I met people who respected what I had done, clients who valued integrity over illusion. I learned that in a world obsessed with surface, authenticity has currency. People began to seek me out for work, not just because I was good, but because I was trustworthy. It's strange how reputation rebuilds itself when you stand for something real. Then came something I hadn't anticipated. Years later, long after the dust had settled, a mutual acquaintance told me that he had changed. Not dramatically, not completely, but meaningfully. He had begun working differently. He had become careful, deliberate, even fair. He had started mentoring younger collaborators and had stopped cutting corners. The information didn't make me happy in a vengeful way. It gave me a quiet sense of relief. Maybe consequences had finally done what empathy couldn't. Maybe he'd learned. That's when I realized something essential. Fallout isn't about punishment. It's about correction. When handled with structure and patience, consequences can be catalytic. They don't have to crush. They can recalibrate. They can change patterns that would otherwise repeat forever. And that's the kind of justice that actually matters. The kind that ends cycles instead of fueling them. For me, the real work of fallout was internal. I had to forgive, not for him, but for myself. Forgiveness wasn't about absolution. It was about freedom. If I stayed angry, I'd still be tied to him, reacting to him, defining myself by his shadow. Forgiveness meant untethering. It meant saying, you no longer get to live rent-free in my mind. I released him, not because he deserved peace, but because I did. Life moved on. He continued, quieter now, with fewer eyes on him. His world was smaller, but steadier, perhaps finally honest. Mine grew, not louder but stronger. I built new projects, formed collaborations rooted in transparency, and established boundaries that protected my work and my well-being. Every new success felt earned, not stolen. Every connection felt cleaner. The process also forced me to confront myself. Not just what he'd done, but what I'd allowed. I examined my tendency to trust too quickly, to offer help without formal agreements, to believe that kindness was enough protection. It wasn't self-blame. It was education. I learned to structure my trust, to lead with contracts before compassion when business was involved. And in that discipline, I found security. I stopped confusing goodwill with wisdom. In the quiet aftermath, I began to appreciate the true nature of fallout. It's not destruction. It's transformation. The world doesn't burn just to hurt you. It burns to clear the field for something better. What emerged from that fire wasn't bitterness, but clarity. I became stronger, sharper, harder to deceive. My life stopped revolving around someone else's validation and began orbiting my own purpose. That's what fallout really is. The settling of truth. After the explosion of illusion. It's messy, yes, and costly. But in that wreckage, you see who people are and who you've become. And when the dust finally clears, you find yourself standing taller. Not because you won, but because you survived and understood. You learned to rebuild without apology. And that, more than any revenge, is the real victory. Resolution doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or fanfare. It creeps in quietly, like dawn breaking after a long storm. Gradual, understated, but undeniable. There was no grand confrontation, no cinematic closure, just the steady realization that the tide had turned, and I was finally standing on solid ground again. He had lost his rhythm. The world that once revolved around his charm and influence had slowed. People no longer rushed to attach themselves to his name. Projects that once depended on his involvement now moved forward without him. The silence around his brand was telling. Not cruel, just conclusive. Momentum once lost rarely returns in full. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to gloat or remind anyone of how it all began. The truth had already done its work. My momentum, on the other hand, began to rebuild quietly. It wasn't explosive growth. It was consistent progress. Emails answered, proposals accepted, collaborations restored. The projects that had been co-opted were now properly credited. People started acknowledging my work publicly, not out of pity, but out of respect. It wasn't about being celebrated. It was about fairness being restored. And fairness, after chaos, feels like peace. One afternoon, I received a message from a client I deeply admired. Someone I had respected from afar, but never imagined would know my name. They offered me a long-term partnership, citing not just my work ethic, but my integrity. They had heard about the quality of my projects, not the noise surrounding them. That one contract changed everything. It gave me stability, space to breathe, and the confidence to build beyond survival mode. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't chasing short-term fixes. I was creating something sustainable. That was not revenge. That was evolution. There were smaller victories too, the kind that don't trend, but mean everything. A public correction from a publication that had once misattributed credit. A quiet apology from someone who had stood by him during the conflict. A few friends, once distant, reaching out to acknowledge they had misunderstood. And new people entered my life. Collaborators who didn't just admire my skill, but respected my boundaries. Each of those moments stitched something back together in me. He, too, began to change, or at least to act like he had. He reached out to mutual contacts with a softer tone. His posts shifted from self-promotion to humility. I can't say how deep the change ran, but even surface-level accountability is better than denial. Life has a way of reshaping people when consequences finally sink in. I didn't need to know whether his transformation was sincere. It was enough that he could no longer harm others the way he once had. Still, my resolution came with its own costs. I lost months of my life to the cleanup. Emails, legal reviews, corrections, emotional recalibration. I missed peaceful evenings and restful weekends. My mind was occupied with details, receipts, and the constant demand to stay vigilant. That's the part people don't see. The emotional fatigue that lingers long after the win. You carry it quietly, the weight of doing the right thing. But I would pay that price again, because in the end, the cost of silence would have been greater. What I gained in return wasn't triumph. It was equilibrium. The ledger was balanced, and the noise faded. I got my name, my work, and my peace back. But I also gained something harder to define: discernment. I became sharper about who I trusted, more deliberate in how I structured collaborations, and more unapologetic about setting terms before giving energy. Pain had trained me into precision. Sometimes people ask if I regret how I handled things, if I wish I had taken a softer, quieter route. And I understand why they ask. We live in a world that rewards quiet endurance and calls it maturity. But the truth is, not all wounds heal in silence. Some require exposure. Some need light to close properly. Correcting the record wasn't about revenge. It was about prevention. It ensured that what happened to me wouldn't happen so easily to someone else. The real resolution didn't look dramatic. It wasn't cinematic revenge or public triumph. It was a simple afternoon. Me sitting at my desk, sunlight filtering through the blinds, signing a new contract that secured my stability for months. My phone buzzed with congratulations from people I respected, not because of what I had endured, but because of what I had built after. I leaned back, breathed deeply, and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Calm, not excitement, not adrenaline, just calm. That was my victory. Quiet, grounded, and mine. Not borrowed, not dependent on someone else's downfall. Just earned, line by line, through every sleepless night, every tough conversation, every ounce of persistence it took to reclaim my name. It didn't look like a climax. It looked like a woman rebuilding her life. One honest contract, one fair collaboration, one peaceful breath at a time. And maybe that's what resolution really is. Not the end of a story, but the steady heartbeat of a life reclaimed. If there's one truth I've learned, it's that survival isn't about revenge. It's about structure, clarity, and self-respect. This story was never a campaign of destruction. It was a recalibration. When someone underestimates you, they expect silence. They rely on your hesitation to keep them safe. But when you stop shrinking to preserve their comfort, the balance shifts. That's what happened here. I didn't burn bridges. I revealed what was already collapsing under its own weight. People who use others often assume their charisma will cover the damage. They forget that charm fades when truth surfaces. The world might adore a polished image for a while, but it remembers integrity longer. And integrity, once visible, attracts its own audience. Quieter, smaller maybe, but loyal. That's the long-term win. That's what sustains. Lesson 1. Document your value. If you're creative, treat your work like an asset, not a favor. Keep files, dates, messages, drafts. Archive everything. Don't let politeness replace professionalism. Trust is not a substitute for terms. When you collaborate, make it formal. Contracts aren't a lack of faith. They're proof of respect. I used to think good faith was enough. I learned the hard way that it isn't. Protect your talent the way a builder protects their tools. Carefully, consistently, and without apology. Lesson 2. Never confuse charisma with integrity. People who harm you don't always look like villains. Some look like opportunities. Some sound like mentors or partners. But watch what they do when credit, money, or accountability is on the line. Promises mean nothing without proof. Real character is visible in patterns. Consistency over time, not speeches about loyalty. When someone shows you who they are in their actions, don't rewrite it to fit your hopes. Lesson 3. Consequences can be humane. Justice doesn't have to roar to be effective. When I confronted what happened, I used documentation, not destruction. Facts spoke louder than anger ever could. The goal was correction, not chaos. People often mistake accountability for vengeance. It isn't. It's a system of truth. One that says, you don't get to take from others and walk away untouched. And when done right, it doesn't just fix one situation. It strengthens the whole environment. Lesson 4. Rebuild intentionally. Pain can make you impulsive. It can make you want to prove something fast. Don't. Take that same energy and build something lasting. I stopped chasing approval and started designing protection. Financial stability, legal clarity, emotional boundaries. That's what power really looks like. Revenge fades. Structure endures. Rebuilding well is the most profound form of recovery. It tells the world you're not a victim of the storm. You've become the architect of your next chapter. And finally, forgiveness. The hardest lesson. Forgiveness isn't a trophy you hand out to the person who hurt you. It's an internal recalibration. It's saying, you don't get to live rent-free in my head anymore. I didn't forgive to absolve him. I forgave to free myself. There's a sharp difference between closure and capitulation. You can forgive while still demanding accountability. The two are not opposites. They are balance. People sometimes ask why I didn't just walk away quietly. Because walking away leaves the record messy. And messy records hurt others down the line. I spoke up because silence protects repeat offenders. I stood my ground not to prolong pain, but to set precedent. That truth deserves daylight. That fairness isn't optional. Yes, it cost me energy, money, time, and peace. But it gave me something better, credibility. And credibility is currency that compounds. If you've been through something similar, betrayal, professional theft, emotional exploitation, hear me clearly. Don't let shame mute you. The people who wrong you count on your silence. Break that pattern. Speak when you have proof. Build your case. Use systems. Don't fight messy. Fight precise. Let discipline be your rebellion. He thought leaving me for someone richer meant leveling up. What he didn't anticipate was that I would level myself up. Intellectually, professionally, and emotionally, I learned how to negotiate. I learned how to defend my work. I learned how to thrive without relying on borrowed validation. That was my real revenge. Not heartbreak avenged, but power reclaimed. So, if you remember nothing else, remember this. Be smart. Be prepared. Protect your work. Protect your worth. Charm is temporary. Character is permanent. Life eventually aligns itself with truth. And when it does, make sure you're standing on the right side of it. That's not revenge. That's restoration. And restoration, done right, is the most dignified form of victory.